I'm Nel Dutt. I'm an assistant professor at Bocconi University, and I've been there for the last 5 years. Before that, I was completing my Ph.D. at Duke University in the US, and my research interests are broadly in the area of understanding from problem-solving activities and the impact of that on various outcomes of performance. I'm particularly interested in issues pertaining to environmental strategy. So a lot of my research looks at contexts such as renewable electricity and waste management, but I'm quite broad in terms of the theories that I draw from. So one of the things I highlight to my business strategy undergraduate students who are in Italy, a country where businesses tend to, if they become successful, stay successful for a long time, is that the rest of the world can be quite different. And if you contrast the average age of firms in Japan versus the US, there's a big difference. And within the US as well, over time, there's a big difference. And so I think recognizing the impact of being able to adapt, being able to change on the overall success of a company is becoming a very important part of both academic research but also the practical challenges that companies face. So I would say more than ever this research is just as relevant as it's always been, but perhaps we should distinguish that these findings that we make may apply in very different ways across different types of contexts. And so that would be, I think, a limitation to maybe applying a one-size-fits-all theory, while recognizing that the empirical contexts today are different from they were 50 years ago. This is another research area, so looking at the development of renewable electricity technologies and how they are deployed and how they're adapted in different settings. That's very, very interesting. So on the one hand, you have lots of established models of technology adoption. And in many contexts, or many different countries, we see exactly that sort of dispersion happening, even with renewable electricity. So if you look at the German market, there's a lot of dispersion. It's happened, some of it's happened also at the consumer level. So communities have come together and kind of pushed the government to push further on adopting more renewables. At the same time, most of my dissertation research actually looked at this in the context of the US, and there you see the role of lobbying and non-market strategies being just as important as the traditional technological adoption perspective. I think understanding how the institutions influence how technology is perceived and how regulations are perceived is critical. So once again, I would say at this point, interestingly enough, India has a higher renewable electricity percentage than the US. And if we just took a perspective of developed countries being further along the learning curve of new technologies, we wouldn't expect that. And this just goes to show that the role that the institutions and non-market strategies play are also really important. If we focus on the US, I think understanding the role that state governments play and lobbyists play in how these technologies are perceived and how regulations around these technologies are perceived, particularly since in the past year or so, some states have rolled back requirements. Interesting time theoretically to see, but practically not so good. I have a project where we've looked at this that's already published, and I have another project where I'm looking at this also in relation to the role of helping female entrepreneurs. So how does gender interact with these different contexts? And we don't have formal findings yet, but again, the thing that's really interesting is that we have a language around what developed incubators or developed accelerators do, and they provide a set of services that usually help startup ventures perform better, either during their tenure in the accelerator or after they leave. In the case of emerging economies, the role that incubators or accelerators or any sort of mentorship services provide are very different. So for instance, we did a number of interviews for the AMJ piece that you referred to, and it was myself as well as Olga Horn, who was a PhD student at Duke, who's originally from Russia, Annalena Vidal, another PhD student from Duke who's originally from Chile. So we did interviews with incubators in all these 3 different countries. And the kinds of services they provided were really different. So in India, for instance, giving access to a working phone line at that time was a really big service that the incubator could provide. Having a space where you could make phone calls without being restricted made it much easier for entrepreneurs to start their business. In Chile instead, which is a bit more developed, actually substantially more developed, I would say, the help that the entrepreneurs were getting was with drafting a business plan. And these sorts of services are very different. But what we found was that we could sort of classify them along these 2 continuum. One, the case of business capability development services, which seem to be more prevalent in more developed countries. So the Chilean incubator providing the information about how to write a better business plan versus the Indian incubator essentially providing a very basic infrastructure service. Interestingly, our starting point was the literature on incubators in developed countries. And there we found that the logics and the focus of these incubators was so far down the line of providing access to financial capital, to mentors, but very little focus on the actual infrastructure, that in the end it wasn't as helpful as it could have been. So I guess I would say that there's very different needs in different environments. And the entrepreneurs and the startups themselves are actually also very different, right? Because the problems they're trying to solve in a place like India, in most of Southern Africa, is very different from the goals that your students here in Lyon might have about what companies they want to start and how they want to be successful. So discovering that there's not even a same language that you can really apply across developed and developing countries was interesting. But of course, coming up with a typology also I think was hard, and the interviews were very helpful in getting to that. The most important thing to keep in mind is that you need to do this for yourself. You have to be internally motivated and make sure there's certain things both about the outcomes of our job, so publishing, presenting at conferences, interacting with nice people, being invited to give seminars, but also the daily glut of doing research, the cleaning the data, running analyses, writing, rewriting drafts, interviewing people on the shop floor. You need to enjoy both parts of it, because the truth is there's a lot more of the second type and very little of the first type. But if you don't do all of the grunt work of actually producing the research, the second will never come. So I would almost say that you need to enjoy the first type more, and then that will automatically lead to the second. And you need to be patient both with the process and yourself about new industries, new methods, new theories. But it also means it takes a very long time to actually become an expert at any one thing. And so being patient with yourself is important. If you actually enjoy parts of that grunt work, then that becomes a lot easier. Another thing that helped me a lot is working with really great co-authors. So, we all know the research process is slow. So having somebody else that you enjoy collaborating with, talking with on a weekly basis can make a big difference as you develop your ideas and try and publish your research. At a PhD student phase, I would say it's also very important to be curious, to be broad thinking. It's not particularly efficient, but you're trying to expand what you know, so that the thing that you choose for your dissertation or your research focus is something you're truly excited about, not something that happened to be conveniently have a lot of data in that 1 year. So this is where I would say that taking some time to really explore in the long term is beneficial. At the same time, I understand it's tough to do because research itself takes a long time, collecting data takes a long time, and of course you need to finish your PhD and get a job. But trying not to be too instrumental or too focused early on, I think is a better strategy, or at least that's something that worked for me.